Hello and welcome to the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast, where we discuss self-aware leadership with thinkers from around the globe. I'm your host, Nia Thomas. Join me as I talk to today's guest.
Hi listeners, and a very big welcome to the show to Vicky Brockley. Vicky has a 30-year background in predominantly manufacturing, having taken on many leadership roles and functions during that time. And as you can imagine, being a female leader in manufacturing hasn't always been easy, but it's been an incredible learning journey, and I'm sure Vicky's going to tell us a little bit more about that shortly. During that time, she was drawn to sites that needed to transform, and she began developing her expertise in business turnaround. And she's interested in that turnaround, both culturally and financially. And she found this kind of work really fed her passion for people engagement and organizational culture. But as organizations in the corporate world got bigger, Vicky felt that her voice was being minimized and she just became another number. And that really didn't allow her to work to her values. So she decided to go it alone, focusing on her turnaround passion. She's now a solopreneur focusing on the areas that really drive her, which are people engagement and culture, business turnaround and integration, and leadership development. Vicky, a very big welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Nia, and thank you for that lovely introduction.
So tell us more about what it was like working in manufacturing 30 years ago for a young, capable female. That must have been quite a learning journey for you.
It was a massive learning journey. I think you're probably giving me more credit initially than I maybe deserved by saying capable, because I guess at that point, as a fresh graduate, I didn't really feel like I had a lot of skills in anything, and I was just grateful to have the opportunity within a big organization. It was great that I'd studied business. The organization put me into different roles because I guess I had a broad understanding from my studies. I guess 30 years ago, and this might come as no surprise to anybody, the behaviors that were around, particularly as a young female, aren't necessarily what the behaviors would be now in an organization for a young female starting out. There were inappropriate comments, there was inappropriate touching in the corridor and little tap on your bum as you go in the office. There was definitely...
Certainly wouldn't be tolerated now, would that?
Oh my goodness, no. There was definitely senior leaders exerting a power on occasion. Mm-hmm. But as somebody starting out in the career, I didn't really know what to expect. I didn't really know, is this the norm? Is this the norm everywhere? How do you handle this kind of thing? And I think if I'm totally honest about it, it's only when I look back, maybe after the Me Too movement, and you think about some of the things that you went through when you were younger, not that there was anything as extreme as some of the cases that came out there. When you look back, you realize actually how inappropriate some of those things were. But for all of those leaders, because generally it was coming from the leaders, from all of those leaders that did have the inappropriate behaviors, manner, etc., there were probably 10, 20 times people who didn't treat you that way, who didn't have that approach. And I think what I would say is all of those years ago, I was given many opportunities that for me were way beyond what I felt at that time were either within my wheelhouse, within my experience, within my capability. But I think leaders around that business saw something in me that I didn't see in myself at that age. And some of the opportunities that I was given really have shaped my whole career and my passion for what I do now. So as much as it was, difficult at times, unexpected at times, I think it was a massively wonderful opportunity that I was given very early on. And it's something that I find myself very fortunate that those negative experiences haven't shaped my outlook on the world, haven't shaped the lens at which I look at organizations through. I guess I just accept that that was a time and a place, and now that shouldn't exist. Albeit, if I'm honest, I think it does still exist, but manifests itself in different areas.
What do you think are those key transformations that have happened in those 30 years? I think, smoking in the office and pinching people's bums as they went by, that went out many years ago, I'm glad to say. But what are those key leadership transformations that you've spotted in that time? And whether that is leadership or management or even in the organizational culture?
Well, I think you've touched on it there. It's kind of the language and behavior has changed, or should have changed, I'm going to say, because I still work in a number of organizations where the language, as somebody going into that organization, is actually pulling up leadership teams for the language that they are using or the behavior that they're exhibiting. You would have thought that things should have moved on, and I think in many areas they have. However, depending on the leadership of certain organizations, depending on the age of certain individuals, depending on what people can get away with, then sometimes things haven't moved on. But in theory, the language and behavior should have moved on. I think actually one of the factors that has changed is legal protection. So I think now there's a big recognition that, do you know what? If these things happen, then somebody will pay for this. Somebody will lose their job. This is not acceptable behavior anymore. The other thing that's changed is a command and control behavior. My background was in lean manufacturing from the very early days. And 30 years ago, I guess, prior to lean manufacturing being something that now is widely available in most organizations, it very much was a command and control and very much do to type culture rather than a do with. Yeah. The other thing that's changed is a lack of formality. So I remember when I got one of my first director roles, people were calling me Mrs. Brockley, and I kind of wasn't answering because I was thinking, well, they can't be talking about me because that's my mother-in-law.
Sure.
And I was saying, look, it's just Vicky. Oh, no, you're a director. We'd have to call you Mrs. Brockley. And I was saying, no, honestly, it's Vicky. So I think there's a more of an informality in the way in which we address people, also in dress within the workplace. Again, once over, a man wouldn't dare turn up not in a suit and tie. Now it's a much more relaxed environment where we accept people as being the individuals, how they choose to turn up, rather than necessarily the uniform or the mask that they put on. I think remote working has changed things massively from a cultural point of view, from a teamwork, a support, a development perspective. But within that, you talk about diversity and inclusion, and we now have metrics that look at people and management and organization and culture that we didn't have before. And I think years and years ago, people spoke to people in the right way, or they said, thank you for doing a good job, or they recognized somebody for doing a good job, or they asked how somebody was because they didn't see themselves today, not because they'd been told to do that, or not because there was a measure that was going to say how many times you'd said thank you or acknowledged somebody, but actually because just by being a decent human being, that's what you do. So I think the big thing for me is the fact that organizations, rightly or wrongly, have evolved such a way that now that actually is something that needs to be measured and driven rather than something that just comes naturally.
There's something about civility and politeness and respect in the workplace that I think it is different now than what it used to. But I think there was definitely a deference that there was expected to be paid to people who had the title director, which was not necessarily linked to how decent a human being they were or how capable a manager or leader they were. Do you think that I know we've talked about manufacturing specifically, but you've also worked in other organisations.
Yes.
Is there some kind of connection between the transformation that's happened in different sectors, or do you think it's more linked to individuals or leaders or cultures of organisations rather than is it manufacturing or is it a different kind of sector?
Do you know what? I've thought about this a lot, and I genuinely see the same issues across sectors,
Okay.
with one exception, and that would be the third sector. That would be the charity sector, but that's for a different
Okay.
reason that I can maybe talk about. But
Okay.
certainly, my experience is I feel that behavior and leadership follows a normal distribution, same as most things do.
Hmm.
And, when I look in organizations, sometimes on the very rare occasion, you think they are a real, evolved, self-aware leader with great emotional intelligence, great communication skills, etc. Going back to the further extreme where we talked about inappropriate behaviors, I think those people still exist. That's why I guess narcissists, it's now a commonly used phrase that wouldn't have been used 30 years ago because we weren't badging it that then, but that's what it existed as. So I think you've always got those extremes and then the bell curve in the middle. I do find that who the most senior leader is within the organization can shape the culture and the leadership team and the type of leaders that are within that business and what is valued. We have technical leaders in business because they happen to be either the best at fixing the machine or the best problem solver. And rather than recognizing that as a key skill that they have and keeping them in that area of work, often they are promoted to lead in that team of people. But the truth of the matter is, I think in many of those technical organizations, whether that's manufacturing, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's plastics, wherever it is, I think the value comes in the technical piece. The value comes in somebody who is able to be in a room and talk the technical facts, or when we get a problem, they are the one that everybody goes to in order to solve that problem. And that's where we think, oh, that's great. They are in the right leadership position because when we get stuck, that's who it is that's going to get us out of this. I think the common thing that I find throughout business is that we very rarely put the value on the leader who is the person who's capable of getting those technical people in a room and facilitating a rounded conversation by listening to different views, by getting different insights, by asking probing questions, by coming at it from different angles, and still coming up with the answer, or possibly a better answer, because now you have more varied views feeding into that answer. I think I'd find time and time again that that level of leadership is valued less than the person who can talk the technical talk. And I think often what I find within trying to drive sustainability in business, and by that I don't mean necessarily environmental sustainability, I mean sustainability of results, is with those technical leaders, it's difficult to drive that sustainability through the organizational culture because they don't know how to do it through the people that makes the people get it, and understand why we need to do this repeatedly.
I think that's interesting. That's something that definitely came out loud and clear in my study, is that there is a difference between hard skills and what I call relational skills.
Yeah.
And I think certainly when you were talking about manufacturing, you
Yeah.
have to value those technical skills because it's a highly technical industry.
Mm-hmm.
However, you have to have those people with those relationship skills who can bring those people together to bring the collaboration, the ideation together to be able to create sustainability for that organization. Yeah, and I definitely agree with that.
And don't get me wrong, I have seen technical managers who were able to do both. And those are so powerful when they're able to put their ego to one side to think, I actually know the answer to this, but I'm not going to come up with the answer. I'm going to see what other people think because I have sufficient awareness and I have sufficient confidence and so on about what I bring. And when you do see that, as I say, it's really powerful to have the two together, but it's very rare that you see that.
In this podcast, we're interested in self-awareness and self-aware leadership. So if I say self-awareness to you, what does it mean to you and how do you define it?
To me, it's about 3 M's and an I.
Okay.
So I think there's a macro level, there's a micro level, there's a mindset, and then there's the impact on others.
Yeah.
So from a macro level, it's about me really understanding who am I in terms of my values and belief system. Where do I feel most aligned and centered? Who do I like to be around? What kind of people do I like to be around? Why do I like them to be around? When do I find that I thrive more than others or excited more than other times? The first start for me of self-awareness is having that real understanding of who am I in a perfect world? What would make me feel aligned and grounded? The micro level is then, okay, taking that, then say, right, how do I feel in this moment? How do I feel going into this meeting, into this conversation, into this negotiation, whatever it is that I'm going into? How do I feel going into that? So, do I feel ready because I've done all the prep? Do I feel confident? Do I feel a bit anxious? Do I feel there's going to be a conflict here because that person always turns up with a level of animosity? And it's about thinking, is that coming from me or is it coming from them? Is it driven from me not being fully prepared or not being comfortable in this space? Or is it from them maybe feeling a bit challenged or a bit uncomfortable about what it is I'm asking or what it is that I'm bringing? It's about understanding this next interaction I'm going to have. How am I feeling about it? Because then I think if I know how I'm feeling in this moment, the next part is about managing my mindset for that to make sure that I go into that with the best mindset that isn't, okay, I know they're going to meet me with animosity, and so I'm setting myself up for a fight. It's about me getting my mindset in a place of saying, okay, I'm calm. This doesn't need to be a fight. I need to listen. I need to think about where they're coming from. So I really need to get my mindset in a place of having thought through what might come, but how do I want to approach that situation? And then the last bit for me is once I'm in that situation, being mindful enough to know the impact that I am bringing and that I am having on others, and actually having sufficient skills to be able to adapt in that moment, depending on how that situation is playing out, in order to get the best possible outcome for both parties, not for me, for both parties of that interaction. So I think self-awareness is multifaceted. And when you truly are self-aware, you should be thinking on all of those levels.
Yeah, I think you're right. Multifaceted is right. And the number of people that I've spoken to about what is self-awareness, and Jackie Frost, she talks about it. It's like peeling the layers of an onion. Once you start asking the question and trying to find the answer, there are lots of different layers. Listeners, if you ever find yourself in a test and you're asked to define self-awareness, you now have 2 ways of describing it. One is Vicky's way, which is macro, micro, mindset, and impact. And you've also got mine, which is reflection, recognition, and regulation. Brilliant, Vicky. I really like that. I've written that down and I might be borrowing that in the future.
Oh, please feel free.
So you essentially cut your teeth in a sector that was born in the industrial age, and organizations were very hierarchical, as you've already said earlier, command and control. So, what are your thoughts about self-awareness when we're thinking about people at the most strategic level of organizations? And we might be thinking about the private sector, the commercial sector, or the charitable sector, as you've mentioned. What are your thoughts on those different kinds of awareness that you're seeing in people at different levels?
At the most senior levels, it's very rare that I've come across somebody who is really self-aware. I feel often that people at that very senior level are there because they're extremely good strategic thinkers or great long-term planners or strategists, or they're actually great at speaking to the investors or, talking to the shareholders. And so they can really sell the strategy and what that's going to do to the share price and why that would be a good idea to invest or whatever it may be. But I find that the level of self-awareness to execute those strategies often isn't there. But what I do tend to find in the more successful companies that I've either been in or dealt with is that those senior leaders are self-aware enough to know that I need to have a team around me who can actually deliver the kind of things that it is that we're talking about. In certain functions, you will have more than in others. And often what I'm finding is there's so many occasions where you look at a board and the only female on the board is HR, and that HR is the voice of the people. It's the voice that regulates behaviours. It's the voice that makes sure that we're continuing to look after the people. Just by making it to being the CEO does not mean they are the most evolved leader with the highest level of self-awareness and the biggest EQ out there. It just means that actually they might be very smart, might be very strategic and get their results through their team rather than necessarily because they are bringing the full package themselves.
That's very interesting. My background is public sector and now charitable sector, and all of my research and lots of my guests have come from that sector, and they say the same thing about strategic level leaders. And I didn't know whether you would say the same from a manufacturing sector. So it's very interesting that there is such commonality around strategic level leaders not being sufficiently self-aware. So I guess that means we need to keep talking about it and keep writing about it and keep podcasting about it.
We absolutely do.
So even though manufacturing is where you began your career, you've also worked in other sectors. You mentioned the charitable sector, but you've also worked in oil and gas. But are there any leadership commonalities that you spotted across those? I mean, very different sectors, but nevertheless, there may be some commonality.
I think there's very much commonality in what I would say, if I take manufacturing, if I take oil and gas and other technical industries that I've worked in, and even I spent some time within distribution. Throughout those, I see lots and lots of similarities. When I go into those kind of businesses, typically I'm finding the same kind of things, so we talk about technical leaders being promoted, people not looking after people or process, but we have great problem solvers. So we have people who love to step up as being the hero, love for a big problem, and this is the answer, and don't I look great, and so on. But I think there is very much a driver on the result. The real focus is on either the numbers, whether that's an efficiency, whether it's a profitability, whatever it may be. So it's on the delivery of the numbers. Or if I'm making something, it's on the delivery of the product at the right quality. It's very much around that. And in order to do that, you need to have a management of available resources. I often find that there is a cost element that mean that people are always looking at, can I do more with less? Or am I getting the most out of that person? Or if I invest in this, can we do something different? Can we do something better? So there's always a focus on the task and using available resources in order to do that. By comparison, I've done some charity work. And what I've found is that there appears to be less focus on your available resource. And actually, what could I do with that available resource to get a better outcome? And what I mean by that is when I've gone to various organizations as a volunteer, so the people who I'm volunteering with can see that I have a detailed background where I understand people, I understand leadership, I understand processes, I understand how to make money. And somebody would say to me, can you fold those clothes in the corner? Or can you put that food parcel together? One example, I worked for a charity for youth homelessness. And eventually I just thought, you could get so much more out of me. And I asked to have a meeting with the CEO. And I just went to him and I said, look, you've got me. I'm committing to this for the next 6 months. So really, is there something that would add value? Because I wanted to come here to add value and I think I can do more for you. So I ended up working in a young offenders institute, writing a resettlement training program for them, then getting some government funding for them to run this program, and then rolling out the program, because in order to get the funding, we needed to establish whether it was one-on-one training with the offenders or one-on-two, one-on-four. In that 6 months, I wrote the program, got the funding, rolled out the training and so on, and then left and gave them something back. Now, had I not facilitated that conversation, I felt there was nobody within the charitable sector, and that was just one example, but I've seen it elsewhere, who was actually looking at the people who were coming through the door and thinking, is there something more challenging I can give them that is really going to move this organization forward, even if it is for a limited period of time? So that for me is the gap, that I don't think people are looking sufficiently at the resources and at the tasks that could be allocated to those resources.
Ask, there is something about talent and skill management, certainly within the volunteer workforce, that you've spotted. And that's quite interesting. And I think there will be lots of people in charities thinking, if only they had the resources to be able to deploy members of their corporate team to be able to identify those skills within their volunteers, they would love to. And I think sometimes it does come from the volunteers having to share their skills to be able to feed that to the organization, to say, maybe I can volunteer and do something different. But that's a really interesting observation. Explain to us a little bit about what you do when you go into organizations to help them turn around.
Often I would either be approached by the CEO or the MD, or quite often now, actually, it's by investors who think, I've bought this and it's not performing how I want it to perform. The numbers aren't what I want them to be. So in those initial conversations, whoever it is who's approached me generally will have an idea of, can you come in and can you have a look at this particular area? Because I think we have this particular problem. Mm-hmm. They would tend to point me in a direction. What I've realized is, more often than not, that initial conversation and what they think is wrong is not actually the root of the problem.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that people are often looking at the output in order to establish what the problem is, i.e. the profit and loss. So they're looking at a set of numbers in isolation to say that number doesn't look right, or doesn't look big enough, or in fact looks too big, and therefore that's what the problem is. But actually the root of the problem is generally somewhere else. My approach would be, after that initial conversation, go away, do a couple of days investigation, or however long it is, depending on the size of the organization, and come back with a proposal. I know a lot of people would start at the top and start, with the management teams and say, what do you think's going on? What do you think the issues are? I will start at the shop floor. I would start at the people and process. I would have a walk through the process, because I think, having spent so much of my career looking at process, you can often look at a process, talk to people who are running a process and know what's right and what's wrong with it quite quickly. I will talk to as many people as I possibly can, because I find that often within an organization, people know what's wrong. We just haven't bothered to ask them. So the more people I can speak to, the more threads that I can get to pull on. And often after a few conversations, there'll be a common theme coming up, which I can then in subsequent conversations pull at that particular theme. I'll start working at a shop floor level through the processes, and then I would work my way up through maybe some of the management team, and then I would look at the numbers. I find that that approach works better for me, because if you start by looking at the numbers, it can lead to you having a predetermined outcome that isn't necessarily the right one. So an example, recently I was working and a CEO said to me, we just don't have the best leadership teams. We're just having jobs for the boys. We're not getting rid of people. We've improved efficiencies. We've just got too many people. My labour bill's too high. Can you have a look at the organisation structure, change the org design and get rid of some people? That was his assessment based on the numbers. When I looked at the processes, talked to the people, the problem was that the quality was out of control, absolutely out of control, and nobody was working on measuring it, looking at fixing it. In essence, people were making things 2 and 3 times. Yes, the labour costs were incredibly high, but that wasn't because we had too many people. It was because we weren't in control of the process of good quality and making things right first time. Had I just gone off with his guidance, I could have quite easily done an organisation design with much fewer people, but ultimately it would have cost him much, much more in the business, because we would have just let more customers down with more poor quality. So I never trust the initial instruction that I'm given. I'll always say to the client, I need to go and look, see, and find out for myself. I'm very lucky in quickly being able to join those dots and see where the issue is. And then for me, it's about putting together a very simple plan that can be clearly communicated. And the reason I say that is often at the point that I'm brought in, these people are desperate and are like, just fix everything. And again, I'll say the answer is not by fixing everything. It's doing it in manageable ways that can actually fix something and makes it sustainable and move on to the next thing. But the whole time that we're doing that, creating alignment through the organization, creating very clear communication such that the whole workforce knows what it is we're trying to do, why we're trying to do it, and how we are progressing against what it is that we're trying to do. And for me, that's what drives the whole people, engagement, inclusion side, and therefore ultimately better and more sustainable results.
That's really fascinating. I don't think I've ever had a conversation with anybody who focuses on organisation turnaround. So it's really interesting. And I'm already thinking of companies that really need to give you a call. Vicky, there is a real push now to encourage women into STEM. And for maybe colleagues in different parts of the world who don't know what STEM is, it's science, technology, engineering, and maths. What advice would you give to women just starting in still quite male-dominated sectors now?
This might be a bit of a contentious answer, but the first bit of advice I would give to them is stop thinking about themselves as women. Many years ago, I was given a leadership award, and it was women in leadership, and I was so offended. Thinking, am I not a good enough leader just to get an award for being a leader? I've managed to get a women's one. So I think, coming back to the whole mindset thing, if somebody is identifying themselves first as a woman going into that workplace, they're starting off at the wrong place. There is a reason why they have chosen to go into that industry. And for me, it comes back to that macro element of self-awareness. So who am I? What do I like doing? I know for me, I get bored quite quickly. I have to have something that I'm doing that is quite diverse and quite challenging. And I like getting people together and problem solving. And I love when people have light bulb moments. And I love creating organization cultures where people can thrive and grow. For me, manufacturing ticks all of those boxes. I think for anybody going into any STEM sector, needs to understand, why do I want to go into that? So if they know, I just love engineering, whether that's I love fixing things, or I love mechanical engineering, or I love electrical, I just, love how things work, then I think they need to make sure that they are going into it for the right reasons. This industry aligns to my macro level of self-awareness, who I am, what I like to be doing. Because if those two are aligned and centered to start with, the chances are you are going to turn up in a much more confident and be much more successful than if you start from thinking, I'm an outlier, I'm a woman in this male industry. So my advice would be, don't define yourself first and foremost by your gender. It's more about our personal alignment and what we need and what lights our fire, and does that align to what career it is that I'm going into. And if those things are ticks all of the way, then actually make the most of every single opportunity that you're given. Because certainly for me, I fell into manufacturing because somebody gave me an opportunity and I was thinking, oh, manufacturing, kind of noisy and dirty. I don't think so. And once I got there, after only about 4 months, I thought, oh my goodness, I never want to do anything else. What I would say is be open to what it is and seek out the people that you can learn from and embrace every opportunity that you're given, and always keep checking that alignment is there, because that certainly for me is going to bring the most job satisfaction as well as the most achievement and growth within that sector. But certainly for me, it's been the best sector I could have ever chosen.
Thank you for that, Vicky. And I'm sure there will be people who are listening to the podcast as they commute to work and bouncing in their car seat now. But it isn't the first time that I've heard people talking about that actually, let's get to a point where people are recognized for their skill rather than their skill because they happen to be a woman. And I certainly support that. And when you said that actually you were given a Women's Leadership Award as opposed to the Leadership Award, I absolutely know what you meant.
Yeah.
Vicky, is there anything else you'd like to share with listeners before you go? And maybe that is just how people can get in touch with you?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you. I've really enjoyed it, and I love listening to your other podcasts. So there's always something new that you can pick up from it. If any of the listeners, if anything that I've said sparked a chord within them thinking, that's us, that's me, that's my organization, then the best way to get in touch with me is through LinkedIn, and we can have an initial conversation, a discovery meeting to see what's really going on. So yes, that would be what I would just like to finish on.
That's brilliant. We will make sure that there are links to Vicky's LinkedIn in the show notes and also to Vicky's websites. But if you want to go and find out more about Turnaround or her ideas and background in manufacturing, then you can just get in touch directly. Vicky, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I really wish you and all the organisations that you go in to Turnaround the very, very best. Thank you, Vicky. It's been brilliant. Thank
you very much, Nia. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me on today's episode. Please remember to leave a rate and review on your favourite podcast platform, because a little word from you means a big deal to me. You can also sign up for my newsletter on my website, knowingselfknowingothers.co.uk. Join me next week when we discuss self-aware leadership with thinkers from around the globe. to generate kinder, more respectful and creative working relationships through reflection, recognition and regulation. Looking forward to having you on my learning journey.